Hey there everyone. Today we're going to learn about code refactoring and how it can save you a lot of headaches down the road with your HTML. Hey there everyone. Really glad you could join me again today. So, as I stated earlier, today our main premise is going to be refactoring code. What exactly is refactoring code? Well, it really just means taking a look at our code just in the same way you would look at a broken building or an old house, and go in, find the parts that are a little messy, need a little bit of cleaning, and clean them right up. Essentially the same thing we're doing with code refactoring. We're looking at our code, looking to see if there's any old bits that we might regret programming previously, and organizing everything to be as functional as possible. So most of today is really just going to organize around cleaning and organizing. So with that being the case, let's go ahead and take a step back and look at our previous code. Now, just already looking at it, all I see is this wall of text. Kind of hard to read. If it wasn't for this white text, I really don't think I'd be able to find my way around the code. And let's say I come back to a project after a couple of months. I don't remember what I did in my code. Coming back to see all of this is just going to be a headache and a half. And we can actually avoid that by implementing a couple of new systems. And to start off, we're actually going to go ahead and introduce a new element. So, new element, you say? I say, yeah, we have, and I'm really glad to introduce the div. What's a div? It's one of the most common blocks in HTML when it comes down to it, mainly because it acts as a great filler and a great container for anything in HTML. Now, when I say container, I'm talking about grouping a general subject together. So let's say we have something like my enemies, or the enemies in my game. In this page, I'd really like to be able to control all of these elements with one block. I don't want to have to go in and control each block individually every time I want to make a change, even though I still want to have the power to do that. Sometimes it's easier to just control an entire group than to have to control each one individually. So, just like our other elements, I'm going to go ahead and insert it right here to essentially box in the enemies for myself. So, like this, I'll go ahead and start a div tag and end it afterwards. So, just like that, we have our entire enemies list contained. So, what exactly can I do with this? I'll give you a list of 3 things you can do with divs. First off is the organization. We've already touched on that. But secondly, we can actually start naming these different sections of our code. So, to give you an example, I'm going to introduce a new element attribute. And in this case, it's going to be an attribute called class. With class, we can go ahead and define what this block is called. So instead of div, I'm going to go, well, it will still be a div, but I'm going to call this div container enemy. And like that, we have it labeled. We can't do anything with it just yet. We'll actually get to that when we touch on CSS later on in this project. But now we actually have a way to identify and control our box in the future. And if we want to find it in our code, we can always look up container, and obviously we can type in enemy, but we can actually go ahead and find it in our code that way. Now, if I can perform this search function, why do I need to clean up my code? Why should I spend the extra time organizing all of this stuff if I can always come back and search? Again, if you've been missing from a project for 2 or 3 months and you come back, you won't necessarily remember what you named everything. And having that issue, you'll run into spending more time figuring out your own code than building on top of it. So alongside the use of divs, I actually want to touch on another organization tool when it comes to HTML. And this tool will actually be the comment. So comments in HTML can actually be one of your most essential tools when it comes to keeping your code organized. Plus, it can help you with refactoring a lot in the future. For example, you might run into an issue with your code where you don't have a solution to the problem quite just yet, and maybe you need a week to figure it out. But even in that case, we can, I actually entered in the syntax wrong. Don't make the same mistake I did. And like this, we have a comment. But let me finish my explanation before I review this syntax. Let's say you have an issue you want to solve in the future. Maybe you are in the correct mindset in terms of having a list of what you need to solve your problem. But you come back to your code after a week, and now that you're confident that you can solve it, you're looking at things and you don't remember what anything is. Here comes the comment. With the comment, which is an element tag that only has the opening tag part, but with different syntax. Instead of our normal elements, which are usually bound to letters and numbers, we'll go ahead and use an exclamation point followed by 2 dashes, which will just be the minus key on most of your keyboards, which will end with which will close with a exclamation point, 2 dashes, and then the closing bracket. So now let's actually use this comment. Let's say I want to place a comment about the mission, and I want to change what the mission of the game is further ahead. So in this case, I'll say change mission in future. Now, I may not do the work now, but this will allow for me to jump right back into my code and very clearly see. Usually this would be a different color, something a lot brighter or something that would stand out. And that's actually something we can edit inside a CodePen. But for the time being, let's say I come into my code and I see this in nice bright red. I automatically know that's something I need to touch on and get to before I touch anything else in the code. So what's actually the best use case for a comment, and when should we use them? And to that, most professional programmers will tell you, comment as often as you can. No matter how good of a programmer you are, or how good you think you are, it will save you a lot of time and a lot of pain if you just comment your code. It can be every other line in HTML. It can be every other line in any coding language you type. You'll most likely always find comments in a programming language, and you really can't lose too much. It will maybe cost you a couple kilobytes if you load your web files with the comments. So there's actually a couple of different ways to go about styles for entering comments, I should say. So to begin, we have our single line like we saw there. In some cases, I'll see programmers write out messages in all caps, back to fix. Or in some cases, you'll actually find multi-line comments just to be real nice and obnoxious, which isn't always the case, but you can always do something like this to make it very, very apparent that something needs to be fixed in your code. The final thing we'll touch on for today in terms of the organization of code is actually an organization method for every element on our web page. Earlier you actually saw me use a bit of this rule that I'm going to introduce. And this rule is what's known as BEM, or Block Element Modifier. So in this case, with our div earlier, we went ahead and built ourselves a block. So when I name things in my HTML file, I name them according first to their block. So this block containing the enemies would be considered the container in my naming scheme, and it contains the enemies. But if I actually wanted to follow the rule of BEM, or block element modifier, I would actually say container, the block would be the div, so I'd actually name it as a div, but in this case I'll call it my container, and then its modifier will be the fact that it contains enemies. So container enemy worked. We could really get more specific. Let's say we'll give a class to the title here. So in this case, it would be, our class would be equal to, not a container, but header enemy, and because it's red, that is a modifier, we'll call it red. Now, this tool could actually be useful in the case of refactoring your code, making it a lot easier to find things, because if you come up with a scheme for naming something, like let's say containers, or let's say headers, if you ever want to make a change in your code, you can always, if you reliably built out your system, you can always rely on the fact that you can look up header, and you'll be able to search any header inside of your web page. That's all the content we have for today. Just to review real quickly, we learned about divs, how we can use them to contain a lot of the code inside of our code, comments, and BEM. All of these tools are going to be really useful in helping us refactor code to make it a lot more usable for ourselves in the future. Now, I really do hope you'll be able to join us for the next episode, where we'll touch on images, links, and lists, and how they can really pump up your website.